Good evening, gentlemen, dear speakers. Welcome to the second panel debate of the series related to the House of European History's temporary exhibition, Fake for Real. Truth has been described as the first casualty of war. War is a time when those fighting resort to falsehood and deception. Lies become a weapon. On the other hand, hiding and deceiving can be the only way to save one's life. The dark side of Europe's history are full of lies and denials of crimes. The House of European History displays ample examples about this, both in its permanent and its temporary exhibition. Even when a war is officially over, establishing the facts of the crimes, which were covered up and whitewashed, becomes a task for future decades, often causing further psychological trauma and problems in international relations. The truth is often suppressed for years or even for generations. The way in which mass crimes are dealt with has a huge impact, both on the levels of politics and, at a very private level, on the lives of the families of victims. Unearthing the truth is therefore an important part of post-war periods and an essential component of getting to grips with the past. The truth is uncovered often only decades later, helped by political changes or the opening of archives. This process is inextricably linked to collective memory. What does a society remember and in which way? And it is an essential step towards the healing of trauma and towards reconciliation. So what are the factors which lead to the denial of crimes and those which foster the acknowledgement of facts? What are the different strategies of denial? And how does the denial of responsibility for mass crimes by the perpetrators affect the families of its victims? How do we effectively support reconciliation? This evening, we will address these questions while complementing the historical discussion with a psychological approach. At the end of the debate, a question and answer segment will provide you with the opportunity to ask questions directly to the experts. I'm very happy that we were able to gather around our virtual table such distinguished professors of history and psychology, joining us from St. Petersburg, New York, Lublin, and Brighton. Thank you all for being here. Our lead curator of Fake for Real will give you more insights into how these topics are addressed in the House of European History's exhibitions. As last time, the debate will be moderated by Paul Solomons, an independent curator working to make meaning of difficult histories, just as our museum. Paul, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Constanza. It's a delight to be back with you and to work again with your wonderful museum. Thank you so much for inviting me to host and to moderate today's panel. Thank you to all the participants who are rejoining us, who were with us for the last session, and also, of course, welcome to all those who are new to this series. I really thank you all for giving us your time to join us. And I'm really looking forward to what I'm sure will be a fascinating and important conversation. Denial, says Gregory Stanton, is always the final stage of genocide. It occurs during the crime itself, and it continues for years after. It is a desecration of the victims. It's a final indignity, denying them even the truth of their own deaths. Politically, it's a highly charged issue. It has taken more than a century after the murder of Armenians by Ottoman Turks during the First World War for the US administration just this week to recognize that crime as genocide. My own country, the United Kingdom, still has not done so. Authors and journalists in Turkey who have used the term genocide have been prosecuted for insulting Turkishness. Other memory laws exist in other countries also, and perhaps we'll discuss some of that during today's sessions. And today, China denies mass crimes are being committed against its Uyghur Muslim population. There is denial of crimes against humanity that are being perpetrated against the Rohingya in Myanmar. And the Syrian government has denied the use of chemical attacks and other atrocities perpetrated in the course of a bitter civil war. Today, we are joined by a panel of 4 experts who will examine the phenomenon of denial of mass crimes from a variety of perspectives. Combining psychological and historical approaches, we will consider what factors lead to the denial of mass crimes. What are the different strategies of denial? Denial of responsibility for mass crimes affect the victims' families? How can we more effectively support reconciliation and transitional justice in the aftermath of such traumas? We will begin with an exploration of the phenomenon of genocide, followed by an in-depth examination of the silence and deception surrounding the Katyń massacre, the murder in the spring of 1940 of some 22,000 Polish prisoners by the Soviet Union's NKVD. To open the discussion, I'm delighted first to welcome Rizata Bilali. Rizata Bilali is Associate Professor of Psychology and Social Intervention at New York University, and prior to joining NYU, Dr. Bilali worked as Assistant Professor of Conflict Resolution at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. Her research focuses on the social psychological underpinnings of intergroup conflict and violence in various conflict settings. Dr. Bilali seeks to understand the influence of group identities on intergroup conflict and the psychological underpinnings of conflict narratives, specifically focusing on group membership, denial or the acknowledgement of past collective violence, the factors that drive denial narratives and the strategies to address them. Dr. Bilali, please would you take the floor and help us to contextualize the denial of crimes? What are the types of denial? What are their functions, their factors, and their consequences?
Thank you so much, Paul, for the lovely introduction. I'm going to share my screen now. Thank you for inviting me. It is a real honor to be part of this panel. As a social psychologist, I've been interested in psychological and social processes of denial for many years. I rely on historians' consensus about the facts of specific cases that I address. And because historical atrocities are often contested, I have focused on crimes that are particularly severe, like different forms of mass violence or the crime of genocide. And this includes also work on the denial of the Armenian genocide that Paul referred to, which is especially relevant this week as it marks April 24th, marked the the 106th year commemoration of the genocide that is not acknowledged yet by Turkey. The word denial does not do justice to the complex process of denial, which has political, psychological, and sociological components. Denial is a common, and dare I say, maybe the most common response to historical atrocities and crimes perpetrated by a group or a country. Spontaneous, voluntarily acknowledgement of atrocities is rare. Now, acknowledgement, of course, occurs with internal pressures, external pressures to the states. It might occur if there is a historical break from the past and the current government or regime is trying to break off from the old regime and gain legitimacy vis-a-vis that old regime, or it might occur for achieving other goals. And the second thing that I want to point out here is that we typically tend to associate denial with authoritarian and dictatorial regimes, but denial also occurs in democratic societies, as I'll provide some examples later. Denial comes in different forms. So the first is what is called literal denial, in which it is contested that the crime did not happen. But more common form of denial includes what Stanley Cohen labels as interpretative or implicatory denial. When the basic facts of the event cannot be denied, groups contest the meaning of the events and reframe what happened. And these include employing several strategies, minimizing the harm, for instance, by downplaying the number of the victims, downplaying the responsibility by focusing maybe on a few bad apples who committed crimes, Blaming victims is a common one. Sometimes the victim group is accused of committing the crime themselves, more often of instigating the violence or being an imminent threat to the group, so making the violence a necessity. And blaming third parties for committing the crime or the circumstances. Circumstances is especially important because atrocities often occur during war, and there is confusion about what happens in war, and there is suffering in multiple sides. So denial is often presented here as, saying that all sides have suffered greatly and just leaving it at that. And there is also partial acknowledgement in which parts of the truth are acknowledged, but not the whole truth. In the case, for instance, of Turkey's denial of Armenian genocide, all of these strategies can be identified in their official narrative. Sometimes the story can be flipped to celebrate the perpetrators. So you can see here in the left, the mural of Ratko Mladic ahead of the war crimes verdict for his massacres in Bosnia in the 90s, being celebrated as a hero. On the right side, you can see a memorial of Enver Pasha in Istanbul, one of the masterminds of the Armenian genocide. Recently, with the Black Lives movement taking hold globally, attention has been paid to the celebration over time, over the years, in various European and US cities of slave traders, slave owners, or leaders that have committed atrocities in the colonies. So when does the process of denial start? Well, as Paul mentioned, it starts as the events are occurring, and it evolves over time as new evidence or accusations are brought to light, and as circumstances in society and in the international community change. These can include covering up evidence, leaving no witnesses. Who is recording the events as they are happening is particularly important, and biases that are associated with those reports. It's people who make meaning of facts and evidence, and our worldviews and perspectives shape how we view the facts and what we make of them. Now, of course, historians are trained to detect, avoid these biases to get to the truth, but there are also cases that also historians are not always immune to them. And denial of specific atrocities is embedded in the larger narratives that the group hold, that the groups or countries hold. We cannot understand really denial without understanding these narratives. For instance, the narratives that the group or the country has regarding the relationship with their adversaries, and the overarching narrative of what happened during the period in which the specific crime was committed. There are very strong motivations to deny atrocities. Of course, legal consequences come to mind first. These can include various things from prosecution of the perpetrators, payment of reparations, and giving up a variety of privileges. Sometimes giving up land might be one demand by the groups that have been targeted. I'm particularly interested in social and psychological motivations for denial of crimes. And committing crimes threatens the positive identity of the group, and it undermines the actors' legitimacy, both in the eyes of their own people and their followers, but also internationally. Legitimacy is important to establish the moral high ground in a conflict. As you can see in the picture here, we tend to see conflict through the lens of a fight between good versus evil. And each country, each government tries to establish that they are the good party in that fight. All countries also have a dominant national story, the story of who we are. Typically, these stories celebrate achievements, they portray the group as moral and deserving actor in the international community. They are designed so that group members can take pride, positive esteem, and positive identity in their group. And because of this, such narratives tend to silence the wrongdoing of the groups in the past. And these narratives also serve as lenses through which we interpret and see all the other events. So what this means is that a story of a crime or an atrocity committed by a group does not fit with the general narrative and image of the group as being moral. And atrocities are especially threatening when they threaten the foundational narrative of the group. For instance, for Turkey, as we gave that example, acknowledging the Armenian genocide would require rewriting the narrative of the foundation of the country. So that's a very threatening. In the United States, we can think about, for instance, how the history of slavery or the genocide of the indigenous people threatens specific foundational stories of that country. And lastly, I want to point out that there is competition among nations to gain moral legitimacy by often, for instance, claiming victimhood. And stories of past crimes are also used to score political points in this competition. So lastly, I want to focus quickly on the consequences of denial. For victims and survivors, consequences include continued and often intergenerational trauma, denial of knowing what happened to the loved ones, denial of justice, and sometimes continued victimization and persecution in the present. For instance, I have conducted interviews with people persecuted by the dictatorial communist regime in Albania, which was one of the harshest regimes in the Eastern Bloc, where there has been no proper acknowledgement and no tackling of the crimes of that regime. And the persecuted people mentioned that there has been no changes in history textbook because there was no acknowledgement. They are still portrayed as the traitors. They're saying that they are still discriminated in the workforce, and importantly, that the persecutors are still in positions of power. So denial also leads to continued damage in the relationships between groups and countries, continued hostility, resentment, and perpetuation of further conflict and violence. Healing starts with acknowledgement. But also it's important that acknowledgement is not a single event, it's not a single act, it's a process that constitutes of multiple actions to address the truth about the past and the legacies of the past. And I'm going to stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rosata, for that wonderful introduction. Please, participants who are keen to put questions, feel free to put those into the chat or the Q&A, and we will try to integrate those throughout. Rosata, one of the things I was taking from your presentation is this notion of it's common for all of us, all groups, all nations, all peoples, to mind the past for the kinds of stories we want to tell ourselves about ourselves, right? This is, and yet, how do you account then within a group, within the same group, you do have people who are more and who are less willing to confront these dark aspects. Is there some profiling that's been done in terms of political outlook or upbringing or education or social or gender factors that give us an indication of people who are more willing to confront difficult aspects of their past?
Yeah, this is a very important point. There are different clashing motives and needs for group members. So in one hand, we strive for achieving positive identity with the groups that we belong to, and on the other hand, we also strive to know the truth. And those two can be clashing. So within groups, we know that in each group, right, group members can vary quite a bit in the levels, right, of their denials, and there are different factors that influence this. The first thing probably is their context, right, the social networks, the families, and the communities in which they are brought up, and the stories that they are that they are told, right, since early childhood, and also, I mentioned these dominant narratives or kind of national narratives, but in each group there are also subversive and other narratives that exist at the same time. We can think about narratives, for instance, of coming from their own families, from grandfathers that were in war, that might clash often with those dominant narratives. And this would be also narratives by, people who clashed in the maybe quote unquote the wrong side, that are told and, provide, clues to, right, to others in the community about what really happened. There are also tendencies, so groups, we identify also with multiple groups, and national group is just one of them. And our identities, all the other identities, right, are, can be competing identities with a national group. And they are also, right, important factor in terms of how we view the kind of the evidence. What, for instance, for my studies, what I know is that in surveys of group members from different cases, glorification of the group and perceiving the group as superior to others is a powerful predictor of denials of any wrongdoing that the group has done in the past. So this is, we assess this by asking people, how superior they're, whether they perceive the group as superior from the others, and whether they are glorifying the group in comparison to the others and see their group as the most moral nation, for instance, in the international community. And this is linked consistently across, different samples in different countries with denial. And, there are other factors as well.
Thank you so much. I'll have to return to some of these issues later in our session also. Following that wonderful introduction, that excellent survey of the phenomenon of denial, we'd now like to turn our attention to a specific case that we're going to analyze in some depth, that of the Katyń massacre. And to provide us with some historical context of that mass crime, I wish to turn to our second speaker, Joanna Urbanek. Dr. Urbanek is a historian and psychologist and a curator at the House of European History, part of the European Parliament in Brussels. She is the lead curator of the current temporary exhibition, Fake for Real, A History of Forgery and Falsification, which is the setting, if you like, for this series of 3 events that we're looking into this issue of truth and trust. And Joanna is also the author of Everyday Life in the Shadow of Terror, German Occupation in Poland, 1939 to 45, and also Fear and Anxiety, Varsovians in September 1939. Joanna, what can you tell us about the murders in the Katyń forest, the truth and denial of these crimes, and how you approach this in the museum's current exhibition?
Thank you very much, Paul, for your kind introduction. I am pleased to be here, and what I would like to do would be to show you, to guide you through the exhibition to the extent it is possible. Of course, we are not in the exhibition itself. We have faced COVID measures. The exhibition has been open, so we can welcome our public 3 days a week, from Friday to Sunday. Dear audience, you can visit the exhibition, but not today. Today only online. So I would like to show some slides from the exhibition, and through certain objects, I will try to give you the historical context around the facts that we are discussing today. I will now share my screen. So the exhibition Fake for Real, A History of Forgery and Falsification covers different topics. It shows the history of forgeries from antiquity until the current era of post-truth, very often described like that, the post-truth era. But we claim that forgeries are not a new phenomenon. They are as old as history. But several historical times saw the flourishing of certain fakes. Thus, this exhibition has a chronological context, and one of 6 sections is devoted to the Second World War, the total war, when, as Constanze mentioned in her introduction, the truth became the first victim of this bloody conflict. What are we talking about in this section? One of the case studies which we decided to showcase is indeed the Katyń massacre. This is a war crime which cost the lives of approximately 20,000 people, Polish military officers, policemen, members of intelligentsia, who were captured following the Soviet invasion of Poland in September 1939. Those people were killed by the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, in several places in the Soviet Union. The name Katyń massacre comes from the Katyń forest, where first mass graves were found. Please have a look at this first showcase, where you can see a document. This is a proposal. It's of course a copy, a proposal by the chief of NKVD, Beria, approved by Stalin, to kill the captive Polish citizens who, according to Beria, rejected communist ideology and thus should be eliminated. So Beria concluded that those people are of no use for the communist regime and can pose a threat. That's why a decision has been taken to kill them. Following the war which started in June 1941 between the Third Reich and the Soviet Union, the mass graves of the victim of Katyń massacres were found in the Katyń forest. This was announced to the international public in April 1943. The topic was used by the Nazi propaganda to mobilize the public opinion against the Soviet Union. Here in this showcase, you can see 2 newspapers. One is targeting Polish public opinion. Maybe you can see that it includes very disturbing images of the human remains found in the Katyń forest, which were shown on the first page of this propaganda newspaper. And the other one, which is called Signal, is illustrated photojournal, which was an army propaganda tool targeting international audience in the countries which were occupied by the Third Reich or which were allied to the Third Reich. So you can see a Polish and international context of this Nazi propaganda. Soviet Union denied having anything to do with the massacre. They quickly started claiming that the human remains belonged to the Polish prisoners of war who, and here I'm quoting, fell into the hands of the German fascist hangman, as described in the newspaper of the Polish Communist Union of Soviet Writers, in a newspaper which we also show here. You can see it on your left. Nowe Widnokręgi, published in Lwów in 1944. After the retreat of the German forces in 1944, the Soviet Union conducted their own investigation, concluding that the German occupational forces were to blame for the massacre. In the exhibition, we show a film which is a sort of propaganda means to show a scientific basis for this conclusion. In the film, you can show excavations in the place of massive burial. Bodies are taken to a tent where they are examined by Soviet doctors, and thus this propagandistic picture gives an idea that the investigation was objective, which was obviously not the case, because the conclusion was a denial of this war crime. Have a look at those big pictures, big photos, which are printed on the showcases. In the communist Poland, mentioning the Katyń massacre was forbidden, but people generally knew what happened. So it was a kind of public knowledge. And a number of unofficial initiatives to commemorate the victims took place in opposition to the communist authorities. Those photos come from 1981. One shows graffiti, and another one, a provisional memorial to the victims in Warsaw. They were all soon removed by the communist authorities, who didn't want any conflict with the Soviet Union, and were also engaged actively in denial of the crime of the Katyń massacre. What about personal stories here? In the exhibition, we show a story of the family Gabriel. Jan Gabriel was a police officer who was arrested by the Soviets, and in his last letter in 1940, from the place of imprisonment, he wrote, "I did not harm anyone, and it is probably a mistake. Once it is cleared, I shall return home." This, of course, never happened. His family was waiting for him. They did not know where was he buried, what happened to him. And only in 1991, Zdzisław Gabriel was able to visit his burial place, which is at Miednoje. And here you can see the artifacts, some personal belongings, photos of the family when Jan Gabriel was still alive, a photo of Zdzisław Gabriel visiting the monument that is now erected at Miednoje. And on the right, you can see a cross which is carved from the tree, which grew on the place of burial. So it's a very, very touching personal object borrowed to us by the family. We are very grateful for this. Through this personal story, I would like to also signalize the final how the truth actually surfaced and was officially acknowledged. And this happened only in the 90s. So only in the 1990s there was official objective investigation. It could take place thanks to the pressure from the Polish authorities and Russian intellectuals who were trying to work on this issue and were very much engaged into showing and telling the truth. In 1990, Boris Yeltsin released the classified documents and handed them to the Polish President Lech Wałęsa. Following that act, families could solve even practical issues such as obtaining death certificates, because before they couldn't have them, which had many practical implications. Here in this last image I would like to show you are personal objects which were found in the mass graves during a series of Polish excavations organized in the 1990s. In the middle you can see a bowl with inscription, "Souvenir from captivity," found in Katyń forest during the excavations which took place in 1994 to 1996. This man did not take back this souvenir from captivity because he was killed, but thanks to the fact that this investigation and excavation could take place, at least we have their personal effects and we show them in the exhibition, and we can tell about this story, which is for us very important. And I would like to also thank the Katyń Museum in Warsaw who lended us those objects. Thank you very much, and I'm giving the floor to our specialist historians who are very much engaged in this topic, and also Polish-Russian dialogue on this issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joanna. Thank you for that very clear overview, not only of the key historical events of the Katyń massacre, but also for the glimpse into your very powerful and moving exhibition. It's just such a shame that during these times we're not able to be there in person and to visit, but thank you so much for those insights, and also the insights into the ongoing impact of the trauma on the families of the victims. That's an issue which I'd especially like to return to and take up again later. I'll now, though, invite our two remaining speakers to first each provide their own perspectives on Katyń and the denial of these crimes, and then also ask each of them to comment on the other's point of view so we can generate this conversation between us. After that, we'll open up to a wider conversation and discussion. So first, let me turn to Professor Mirosław Filipowicz, who is Professor of History at John Paul II Catholic University in Lublin, in Poland, of course. He specializes in the history of historiography, particularly in Russian studies, and in 2016 to 19 took part from the Polish side in the Polish-Russian group for difficult issues. As we'll hear, these question of this particular history and the specific case of Katyń has been an ongoing and continues to be an area of difficult conversations between Poles and Russians to this day. From 2015 to 18, he was head of the Institute of East Central Europe in Lublin, a research institute which has actually been closed down by the present Polish government. Professor Filipowicz, please would you give us your perspective on the Katyń massacre?
Thank you, Paul. I am really honored to be invited here and to speak in the company of Rezarta, as we joked before the formal transmission. Poles and Russians discussing history need some psychotherapist some time to time, and our government case is even worse. So that's a great idea to have that psychological voice. But the case of inviting Alexei Miller here is always quite important because, first of all, he is a brilliant historian, but let me reveal the truth. He is also a son of his father, and his father, Professor Ilya Solomonovich Miller, was quite influential as far as revealing extremely interesting sources about Polish history in the 19th century, Polish January uprising against Russia, and without Professor Miller's father help, that couldn't be possible. So we really appreciate what his father did for us. And let me start from okay, may I ask for showing my presentation, please? Thank you. Perhaps next picture right now. Okay. Thank you. What we see here is a map of European part of the former Soviet Union. The map was made by Viktor Sukiennicki, who was a very famous Sovietologist and who was in prison in Russia. He fortunately survived the Gulag camp. Was released after army of General Anders was being formed, and then testified for Katyń massacre in the United States at Madden Commission hearings at American Congress in 1951. So here we see what should be stressed, that Katyń is a metonymy. I will return to that motive later on, but saying Katyń, we understand several places, several camps, and several places of executions. We call it Katyń because Katyń was first discovered and revealed by Germans, and then was the only name to be generally known for that case. But as far as some data, some basic data, after the Soviet army invaded Poland in 1939, 17 September, there was no real state of war between Russia and between Soviet Union, and Poland, because the war was not declared. Even more, the Polish chief commander, Rydz Śmigły, ordered his Polish soldiers not to fight with the Soviet army. So in Soviet archival sources, the Poles are called prisoners of war, but it's not really true. They were detained, but not prisoners in legal sense. But in practice, they were, of course. The number of them was around 25,000. But that is, may I ask for next picture, please? Yeah, because here we have some after-war estimations made by Viktor Sukiennicki too. And here the sum is not up to 25,000. The difference between those numbers and that final 25, even more, 25,000 people is some people were arrested on order by Beria, and all of those officers and those arrested people were treated as irreformable anti-communists ready to fight with Soviet Union. So the decision made by Politburo, the question is if Beria was the initiator or if it was the initiative of Stalin. It's still unresolved. Actually, that decision was made in that atmosphere after the Soviet invasion to Finland and after the deterioration of the diplomatic relations between Soviet Union and Western allies of Poland, Great Britain and France. Who was the initiator? According to the book, very profound book by French historian François Thom, who wrote a biography of Beria. Beria was trying to avoid the executions to the point he couldn't avoid them finally. So when thinking that he couldn't do anything, he just did what Stalin expected him to do. That's a proposal, I think. The decision was accepted by all the Soviet Politburo. May I ask for next picture? And later on, you will see the copy signed by Stalin and members of Politburo. And here we have a picture of Vasily Blokhin. He was a security major of NKVD, and he was the main executioner. Experienced one, I presume, because that was him who was invited or sent to Starobielsk and to Tver, to Kalinin and to Kozielsk or Katyń to lead the executions. It is estimated that he himself killed at least 7,000 of Poles, but the number of Soviet citizens who were killed by him during the great purges of late 1930s is really very difficult even to estimate. It's much, much larger than the number of Poles who he killed. He died in 1955 without any punishment. It was reported that he committed suicide. So my thesis is, when speaking about Katyń, we need more faces and less numbers. Joanna gave us some faces, and I giving you just one face, but the main executioner's faces are quite important to be remembered too, not only the victims, of course. The situation changed dramatically after the German invasion to Soviet Union. May I ask for next picture, please? Okay. Germans discovered the mass graves in Katyń forest quite late. In 1942 or in 1943 early. So they started the excavations, the exhumations, and at least in this case, they were not guilty. They knew that they were not guilty. So they started the activity of international commission. That commission, here we have a picture of one of the mass grave from Katyń forest, and the Hungarian member of the commission hearing the local people. Here we have a German anti-Soviet propaganda poster, and please have a look that the executioner has a strongly how to say Semitic features. So Germans have two goals. First, to accuse Soviet Union, and the other to legitimize the Holocaust crime of their own, because Jews were responsible for many things in their teaching. Katyń as a metonymy. Next picture, please. That was I stressed before. We say Katyń, but there is much broader reality behind that name. And next picture, please. And now we start the case of falsifying the history. When the Soviet Union reached the Smolensk era. The exhumations were repeated, and commission was created by Stalin with Alexei Tolstoy, the writer, and even with Orthodox Metropolitan of Kiev, but without any Polish participant. Stalin even deleted a few Polish names ready to cooperate with that commission. Later on, Soviet government was trying to accuse Germans of Katyń crime at Nuremberg trial, but without any success. And later, the Katyń case was, how to say, fall into oblivion, was forbidden in Soviet Union, and I'm afraid was forgotten. Even now, I think it's interesting to ask Alexei Miller when he personally first heard about Katyń. So that could be my question to my friend. But now, the most interesting case of how the crime was falsified, the Katyń case. May I ask for next picture with the picture of Katyń monument. So there was a village in Belarus named Katyń. The difference between Katyń and Katyń in Polish is phonetical one, but in English there is only one letter of difference. So H letter only. And there was a real tragedy at Katyń, Belarusian Katyń. It was one of the few hundred Belarusian villages burned by Germans, whose inhabitants were killed. But to memorize the tragedy, Soviet authorities chose just one village, which name was quite close to the Katyń forest. May I ask for next picture? And probably next one too, because I made those pictures in 2017 when visiting Katyń memorial, and it's still very moving. What is tragic in that story? A very tragic case, because all those Belarusian villages had been truly burned and massacred by German occupants. But it wasn't the reason for Katyń memorizing, of course. And quite new motive of forgery. There is an old tradition. Stalin expressed it once or twice, saying to one of the Polish leaders, you have been to Moscow, we have been in Warsaw, so there is a, say, remise, there is a balance between us. That's of course not true, but in 1990, someone in Central Committee of Communist Party of Soviet Union, it was probably Valentin Falin, invented the Polish Katyń, say, the Polish equivalent of Katyń. He informed Mikhail Gorbachev that Poles killed around 17,000 to 20,000 of Soviet prisoners of war after the war, Polish-Soviet War of 1920. Then researched by historians, Polish and Russian historians, and they concluded that the cause of the deaths was a natural one, epidemic. The conditions in those camps were difficult, but Polish state, newborn Polish state, quite poor, did make some efforts to improve the situation. No one executed the Soviet soldiers. May I ask for next picture, please? So now it's a time to a Russian voice of truth, the picture, please. So now it's the time to name some names, some Russian names of people who were crucial to the revealing the truth. Alexander Solzhenitsyn in Gulag Archipelago, and the statement of Soviet dissidents and human rights defenders from April 1980, and then the role of Boris Yeltsin, and then a single scholar, Natalia Lebedyeva, who discovered some archival materials and published that in Moskovskie Novosti, Moscow News, forcing the leadership to deal with the matter. Then the role of the Polish, next picture, please. Then the role of the Polish-Russian group for difficult issues under Professor Rodfeld's presidency and Anatoly Torkunov. And the result, white spots, black spots, the edition in Polish, the edition in Russian, the edition in English. A very influential book. And now next picture, please. What we do in Lublin, that Polish-Russian companion for history teachers, published in Russian and in Polish, and available online. You have the address of the site here. It's free of charge. So that is something. We did it with Russian historians and with Russian teachers of history in the very difficult political conditions. And next picture, please. The end. So what to do? According to me, we really don't have much time for the discussion, but according to me, the legal status of the Katyń crime is not as important as the governments seem to treat it. What is more important? We should avoid political presentism. We should go into the micro-historical tendency to see more faces and, of course, not to forget about the statistics. And for Poles, and that I have to stress quite strongly, we have to keep in mind that Katyń massacre was just one drop. The ocean was a massacre against the Soviet Union citizens under Stalin government. So remembering about Katyń, we also should be sympathetic and empathic. That's I think the most important. Thank you.
Thank you, Miroslav. You're ending there as well on this note of understanding and a sympathy for others' suffering, I think is extremely powerful. Makes me think of Michael Rothberg's work on multi-directional memory, where he stresses the importance of understanding of solidarity with victims of other crimes, rather than competition between them. May I just turn now, please, to Professor Alexei Miller for your perspective on the Katyń massacre. Professor Miller is Professor of History and Director of the Center for Memory Studies at the European University at St. Petersburg. He is a leading Russian expert in the politics of memory and has also studied the history of empires and of nationalism. He's visiting professor at the Central European University and has published 7 monographs and edited over 20 volumes, including Nationalizing Empires and Convolutions of Historical Politics. His most recent book is Memory Politics in Russian and Eastern Europe in the 21st Century. Professor Miller, please, would you give us your perspective on the Katyń massacre? Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me here. As you see, I devote most of my time recently to the studies of memory politics. And I would like to address this issue of Katyń from this perspective. So basically, I agree with the story which has been told up to now about the way the Soviets falsified the case. We can discuss the reasons why and how Stalin and his entourage made this decision, because I think that we should remember 2 things. One is that Stalin leadership, beginning with 1920s, up to the moment when Katyń crime happened, used to see Poles, Polish elites, as the enemies. And it is 20 years of permanent confrontation on many fronts: diplomatic, secret services, diversions, whatever. And the second is that making decisions about shooting 10, 15, 20,000 people was rather an everyday practice, starting with 1937 for these people. We find their signatures on such huge lists of those people who were shot by Blokhin and people like him all over the Soviet Union. Now, there are some cases which are not yet clear and probably will not be clear ever. There is a story of Nikolai Zorya, a procurator from the Soviet Union who participated in Nuremberg tribunal. And he was found dead. Allegedly, he committed suicide, but it's also possible that he was killed. And he was responsible for presenting the Katyń case to the Nuremberg court. And we don't know whether he came to conclusion that the case is falsified himself and wanted to do something about it, or he understood that nothing good expects him back in Moscow because he failed to include this case among the crimes of the Nazis. But it's interesting that his son was among those people who actively worked to find the documents which would prove that Polish officers were killed by the Soviets. Now, Miroslav asked a question, when I learned about Katyń. My answer is I don't remember, because From the childhood, I knew that it was one of the Soviet crimes. And in fact, those who wanted to know it in the Soviet Union could learn about it from what we called tamizdat and samizdat. In other words, clandestine distribution of literature and so on. So when we come to 1990s, of course, it was not a pressure of the Polish government and not the pressure of Russian intellectuals on the Russian new authorities, which made them to recognize the case. I believe that that was their political decision. It came together with the decision to recognize the existence of the secret protocols of Molotov and Ribbentrop. And generally, I think that behind that was the idea that we acknowledge shameful pages of the Soviet history, but the aim of doing so was to, how to put it, to overcome the hostility, the lack of trust, and so on. And by dealing with these dark, blank pages, to overcome it and to, how to put it, to reach some sort of reconciliation. Now, things went wrong. We have to recognize it. Things went wrong. And there were many reasons why. To begin with, the question which Miroslav called less important, the case of whether the crime of Katyń is the case of genocide, was actually very important in how things developed. We have to see it in a broader context because all nations of the space which we used to call Eastern Europe, in other words, the former communist states, now have found their own cases of genocide. They all claim that they are the victims of genocide. And of course, they all deny that they ever contributed to any genocidal events on their own. I mean, Poles or Lithuanians or Romanians become very angry when they are reminded about participation of representatives of their nation in Holocaust, for example. I mean, not all the Poles participated, not all the Poles become angry, but you understand what I mean. So the idea that we can overcome hostility and political conflict by dealing with the past and telling the truth about the past was very much rooted in a European approach to memory politics, which dominated 1990s and early 2000s. I mean, the idea that it is a cosmopolitan approach. We can deal with the past, develop a common view of things together. Germans and French can write a common textbook. Germans and Poles can reconciliate. Russians and Poles can reconcile, and so on. But on both sides, Russian and Polish, there were people who believed that politics of memory are first of all politics. That is, that conflict is inevitable part of this politics. And dealing with the past is not about overcoming politics, but about getting advantages, moral, symbolic, capital, etc., etc. I must confess that when I first confronted this point of view, I believed this point of view is wrong. Now I believe it is a correct perspective, not in the sense that I like it, but there are many things in life which we don't like. But unfortunately, politics of memory are first of all politics. And if conflict is at the center of it, then the idea that we can overcome this conflict simply doesn't work anymore. The very term memory, historical politics was coined in Germany as Geschichtspolitik, and this term was strictly negative. It returned into Polish context in 2004, as you know, Mirek, in a different positive sense, like polityka historyczna, and actually we now see how this exactly approach dominates Eastern Europe, including Russia. Now, the cooperation was never, how to put it, among the dominant figures, so to say. I don't think that the cooperation between Russian and Polish sides was always absolutely sincere. And I don't think that both sides were using opportunities which they had. I will give you just one case. If you take a €2 coin produced recently, which features Willy Brandt staying on his knees in front of the monument of to the defenders of Warsaw Ghetto. It's iconic image, which became iconic because people wanted to make it iconic. I must tell you that Yeltsin stood on his knees in front of the monument of to Polish victims in Katyń. Do you know of this case? What I'm trying to say is that we need political will and reason on both sides to see positive steps on each side. And that would allow further dealing with this case. Unfortunately, political atmosphere in relations between Russia and Poland, and not only Poland, many East European countries, has deteriorated greatly during the last, say, 10 to 15 years. And that is why I don't see any good perspective for developing of this memory politics around Katyń for a near future. But I do think that it's very important to keep talking to each other about these things, because besides cosmopolitan approach, which proved to be simply non-realistic, and besides antagonistic approach, which dominates today, there is also a possibility of agonistic dialogue. I mean, dialogue which is based on understanding that we are not going to come to fully similar interpretations of things, but by understanding that our contradictions and differences of perspective should not kill the atmosphere of respect and dialogue, something which actually happened in most of the public sphere during the recent years. So how we can get to this agonistic perspective, agonistic state of dialogue, that would be the question. And I think that on both sides, we have people who are willing to work for that. I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alexei. Thank you, all of you, for those contributions. We've covered so much ground, and there are so many issues, and yet we only have around 10 minutes or so remaining. So it's hard to really identify what should be the kind of key issues. I'm going to attempt something, and but please, if you prefer a different tack, take it that way. It seems where you're ending, Alexei, then on this issue of the need for continued dialogue seems a very important and central one. It comes through each of your presentations, I think. What it made me think of was a number of things. One, that I think we could say that the history, the story of mass murder going back thousands of years has in some sense always been a history of forgetting, because of the kind of stories that we want to tell ourselves about ourselves. And that continues right through to today. So I wonder, Rizata, there seems to be something deep there on a kind of psychological level that maybe you could speak to. This issue of, you mentioned the term genocide there, both Miroslav and Alexei, and the kind of struggles over that term. I wonder how problematic the term is becoming as an obstacle in terms of reconciliation, in that its notion of a kind of crime of crimes seems to lead to a competitive suffering, a competition for memory. How do we get beyond that? I'll throw that open to everyone. You know, how can we get better at recognizing, given all of our nations, all of our peoples have very dark aspects in our past? How can we be better at acknowledging those things? Are there any good examples, you think, anything positive in terms of that kind of memory politics where this has been fruitful? Because the continuing trauma for the victims and their families and their descendants, not only is that an agony for them, but it also seems to me that this is one of the things which fuels further conflict and is maybe an indicator of possible other mass violence in the future if we can't get beyond these things. Those are my reflections for what they're worth on the range of issues that you were all raising. Perhaps, Rizata, you'd like to speak to some of those issues first, and then we can move around. I think these will be probably our concluding remarks, to be honest, because we are so short of time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yes, so the issue of mass murder, as you know, as I also alluded in my presentation, you know, all groups avoid to be associated with mass murder and mass violence, because of because people people distance themselves from identities that are associated with violence and with perpetrators. So there are efforts both from elites, from states, and motivational efforts at the individual level, very strong ones, to maintain that positive identity. And there are a lot of motivations to deny and silence and justify them. And these also occur even at the interpersonal level, right? At the psychology of interpersonal level, which is of course different, but psychologically is also similar to the intergroup and collective violence events. In terms of how we overcome these, I definitely agree with the issue of dialogue. I think the problem with the competition or the politics of memory are particularly problematic, and because there is competition between national states and their national histories, being whitewashed in many ways of any crimes. So we need like a completely different, trying to get a different perspective with each country or each group and each national history becoming more humble in some ways. I'm not sure that there is political will for that, but that's kind of, it's kind of necessary. We need to go beyond this competition of national histories for kind of the for being the moral the good or the moral group in the world, and of course there are political forces against that. I would love to hear from the historians, of course, here, if there are cases of, proper acknowledgement and process that was kind of voluntarily, that it was not with, immense pressure. So we have Germany, but Germany lost the war. It's tricky. I think there have been, for instance, in many places in Africa after various forms of mass violence and genocide, in Rwanda, in South Africa, Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, which were very important in kind of establishing truth, though not without problems, of course. And also, by the way, we know that we talked that it's important for the victims to be acknowledged of the truth, but sometimes often these processes lead to re-traumatization as well. So even in, for instance, even participation and witnesses of in truth commissions, even in, in the Rwanda Gacaca courts, in South Africa, in Sierra Leone, in Liberia, in other countries, studies show that these processes might lead to more reconciliatory attitudes, but they also increase post-traumatic stress and trauma among the victim and victim groups. So if they are not done carefully, they might have harmful mental health outcomes. I'll stop here to leave time for my colleagues.
Thank you, Rosata. Joanna, did you want to comment from the perspective of the museum on some of these issues, or how you deal with this in educational approaches through the museums, or that's up to you?
Mm-hmm. So of course, in museum, it's you always have to deal with hard choices, which of the many stories, also in the context of World War II, you would like to show. And there are practical aspects. Sometimes we are talking about the events which can be portrayed only through the documents, which are not so easily digestible for the audience. So in the museums, we deal with those kind of choices as well, which is not so romantic to mention here, but it's very important to translate those documents, like the note of Beria that we mentioned, and Miroslav elaborated on. They do not give this sort of, perspective and emotional component, whereas they are fundamental for the story. Thus, it is important, as it was said numerous times, to give faces, to mention the names, not only the numbers. So what we did in the exhibition was to also create a sort of a monument to the victims. When my colleagues worked very hard to copy paste basically the names of the victims, thousands of names, which are now presented as a sort of like an audiovisual presentations, where those names go down and the letters decompose at the bottom of the presentation, which is a metaphor of the suffering and of the oblivion around Katyń massacre. So we try to translate documents, something which is dry for a general audience, into different ways of talking about it, also to give this emotional component and let us better understand, but not to use too much this emotional component, because it can also be harmful to the content.
Thank you, Joanna. Miroslav, please, what would your final reflections be on today's discussion?
Thank you. Well, if the Polish-Russian discussion could be reduced to Miller-Filipowicz discussion, that would be very pleasant, but unfortunately there are other participants who are not so easygoing in that direction. I think what we could do, first of all, historians, if gifted enough or if influential enough, could be kind of psychotherapeutists towards their own societies. Sometimes foreign historian is also very, how to say, therapeutic. For example, some English or French historians towards Poles. But we should try that opportunity. Second, to close ourselves in national, say, ghetto. It's the worst idea we could do, because we would be quite happy not having any contacts with the outside world and not being criticized, but we wouldn't be understood at all. So that's the most stupid perspective, too often present now in Poland, I'm afraid. And what we should do, we have to be critical, but the critics is always better to start from ourselves side, not to criticize the Russian part, just be critical towards ourselves. And of course, as Latin, as Romans said, do ut des, I do it because I expected the same. That would be the idea. Thank you.
Thank you. Alexei, how would you like to conclude your thoughts?
Well, I will make several risky statements. To begin with, historians should be humble. They should understand that they are not the most significant and influential participants in this game. Even if it is called politics of history, still it's about politics, first of all. On the other hand, we should be, well, pretty daring in certain sense. What I mean, okay, politicians do what they do, but we should do what we have to do. And here I'm going to contradict Miroslav in one very important point. I mean, it is a reasonable approach when you say, okay, let us concentrate our criticism on ourselves. This is the beginning, but this is not full freedom. Ideally, we should be free to say what we think in Russia about Russian problems, but also about Polish problems. And ideally, on the Polish side, we shall have people who would understand what we say in a way which, how to put it, is aimed at understanding what we say. And when we get such freedom, and when we learn to do the same on our Russian side, understanding that not every critical voice about Russia is the voice based on some Russophobic sentiment. So if we get to this state of freedom, which is not based on, how to put it, politeness, but on daring to speak about serious matters seriously. And if there is a nucleus of these people, at a certain point, when politicians have, so to say, better weather in their minds, we might be able to make an impact. But we have to be ready for that.
Thank you all. One last thought from that you have inspired in me, all of you, is we've talked, of course, about the need to commemorate the victims of these mass crimes and the need to rescue names and faces from the oblivion of these mass graves. And I think we can all understand and appreciate that vital importance in commemoration. Education also, though, provides another challenge, I think. And Miroslav, you spoke to it when you talked about the need to also see the face of the executioner, because it seems to me that actually in our histories and our memories, we've actually preferred the oblivion of the killer, the absence of them almost, because then they can just be explained away and remain the sort of monsters of our imagination, which, while horrific, is maybe easier to deal with because they are distanced from ourselves. And this need to rehumanize all the agents and to recognize how it is that ordinary men and women become involved in, complicit in, and collaborators to these mass crimes give us much more difficult questions. And I think that's one of the major reasons why we continue to, unfortunately, turn away from the reality of these crimes. But of course, that's very dangerous for ourselves and our own futures too. Thank you all for raising such difficult but provocative, important and interesting questions. I'm sorry that we've run out of time. I'd love to continue to chat with you. I hope we will have those chances in the future. Everyone who's joined us, thank you so much for your time. I hope you found it as powerful, as moving, as important as I have myself. And I hope that many of you will return to the third of our series of these conversations in September the 29th. Same time, same place, hosted by our colleagues at the House of European History, when we'll be speaking about conspiracy theories and that impact on trust and truth. Thank you so much.